Welcome to the CCP's 20th Party Congress, What to Expect and the Implications for Washington. Please welcome Michael Cunningham, Visiting Fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center.
Good morning, everyone, or good evening in Asia. So I'm Michael Cunningham. Walter Lohman, the Asian Studies Center director, was planning to moderate this discussion. We've had some technical problems. He's been unable to get connected. And so for that purpose, so that we don't keep you all waiting all morning or evening, I am going to go ahead and moderate this. I know we're a little bit ahead of the curve talking about the upcoming party Congress, but it's never too early. It's never too early, first, because there really are politics in China, which I'm not sure is always well appreciated by observers in Washington. There are not politics like ours by any stretch, but they can be fierce. And just because all of the players belong to the same party doesn't mean that there isn't competition and really a lot of cutthroat rivalries there. So it's never it's never too early to talk about that. Second, there are real consequences that we need to be thinking about now. I think Washington has missed critical developments because it's tuned in too late. Was the rise of a governing model like Xi Jinping's inevitable? Probably. Was Washington late in recognizing it? Everyone seems to agree emphatically, yes. Maybe there are other examples of that. So one disclaimer at the top, this conversation might range a little bit. So speaking for myself, at no time will I forget, and I think at no time will any of us forget, that we're talking about a party that is responsible for repression on a massive scale, genocide in at least one case. The CCP poses a grave threat to U.S. global leadership in the Pacific, to our security, and even to some of the freedoms at home. I do not take any of the figures we're discussing today as Jeffersonians. They're self-professed communists. They are members of a revolutionary Marxist communist party, period. Now, there have been different tactics for pursuing their goals, but that is what they are, and that is how we view them. But so if these things aren't always stipulated repeatedly, it's for the sake of the conversation. So to deal with China, we have to understand the dynamics of the party that runs it. And to help us with this in the context of the 20th Party Congress, we have these distinguished speakers today who are very keen and longtime observers of China. So we've got Dr. Joseph Few-Smith. He's a professor of international relations and political science at Boston University. Dr. Few-Smith is the author of 7 books, including most recently Forging Leninism in China, Mao and the Remaking of the Chinese Communist Party. Joe is a very widely known and respected scholar on these issues. Dr. Willie Lam is similarly well known and respected on issues involving Chinese politics, particularly elite politics. He is now senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation and adjunct professor at Chinese University of Hong Kong. Willie also has several books to his name, as well as a distinguished career in journalism. I know a lot of China watchers always read what Willie has to say about China's elite politics. And then I am Heritage Foundation's visiting fellow covering Chinese politics and institutions at our Asian Studies Center. So I just returned actually from the better part of a decade in China, where I was doing consulting, political risk consulting and whatnot. I just authored an in-depth report on the Party Congress, which you can read. You can find that on our website as well. So without further ado, I'm going to start asking some questions of our panelists. Willie, we're going to start with you. there is such extraordinary unanimity around Xi getting a third term. It's odd that we can be so certain about a system that's so opaque. But is there any uncertainty at all about that? And how about a fourth term?
Right. I have 5 minutes, so I'll go over the issues quickly. It's a foregone conclusion that Xi Jinping will most likely get what he wants.
Willie, sorry, I think we're having trouble hearing you. Maybe if you can talk closer to the mic.
I see. It's a foregone conclusion that Xi Jinping will get what he wants at the 20th Party Congress. That is an unprecedented third term as the number one, the so-called core of the party later on this year. And also, I think there's a very high likelihood that he could get a fourth term. That means his run as the chief of the party, the supreme leader, will go at least until 2032, the 22nd Party Congress. And even beyond 2032, when he will be only 79, the same age as President Biden now, it's possible that he might leave the position of General Secretary of the party, but keep the most powerful position in China, that is the Commander-in-Chief, the Chairman of the Central Military Commission. So you might ask the question whether that is opposition to Xi Jinping's breaking all the rules, particularly institutional reforms begun by Deng Xiaoping in the late 70s and early 80s, which included fixed tenure and retirement ages for leaders, no personality cult, and an orderly institutional-based succession process. However, Xi Jinping is also a astute and Machiavellian politician, so he has been very successful in stoking the flames of nationalism. He has told intimates and other senior party officials that China needs a strongman, a person of determination and savviness to effectuate the so-called liberation of Taiwan and also to challenge the America's position as the hegemon of the Indo-Pacific region. Originally, those plans were targeted. They had a deadline of 2049, which by which time Beijing will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic. But I understand that these goals have been moved forward to the middle or late 2030s, when Xi Jinping will be alive and still has a lot of influence in the party. So regarding the opposition, I won't have time to discuss the two former leading factions in the party. That means the Shanghai faction under former President Jiang Zemin and the Communist Youth League faction under former President Hu Jintao. I will just focus on the so-called members of the Red aristocracy, the princelings, being the offspring of the founders of the Republic, and also former Politburo Standing Committee members and their children. Xi Jinping has astutely used the anti-corruption card, and also since last autumn, he has cracked down on a number of companies, including HNA Group, including Evergrande and so forth, which are backed by members of the Shanghai faction and other opponents. So at this stage, he has many enemies within the party, but his enemies are divided, and they are in no position to challenge Xi Jinping, who is the only member of the Politburo Standing Committee who has day-to-day control of the army, the people's armed police, and the police, as well as the state security apparatus in general. However, Xi Jinping has also made a series of mistakes in the past year, notably his crackdown on a number of actually very successful high-tech conglomerates, beginning with the Alibaba Ant Group, the Evergrande, Fantasia, and so forth, mostly because they were backed by his political enemies, and yet top echelon of the party, Xi Jinping, has come up with this crowd-pleasing formula of common prosperity to justify his action. And regarding the U.S., Xi Jinping has adopted a very hard line to the extent of pulling out Chinese companies which are listed on the U.S. New York Stock Exchange, even though recently, because the economy is not doing very well, which has been affected by the pandemic, as well as the ripple effect of the Ukrainian crisis, which I understand Joe will discuss in detail, so I won't go into this. But Xi Jinping has faced pressure at the very top of the party, so he has moderated his policy. The crackdown on the big high-tech companies like Alibaba have been temporarily stopped, and Xi Jinping has allowed companies which want to list in the New York Stock Exchange to disclose auditing and other detailed information about the companies to the stock exchange authorities in the US. And Xi Jinping is apparently now committed to prevent the decoupling of the two economies, at least decoupling on the high-tech sector. Well, you may ask the question that whether these compromises which Xi Jinping has made is because he needs to get more support at the 20th Party Congress. This might be correct because Xi Jinping is a very obstinate and person who is highly convicted of the correctness of his vision. So his Chinese dream that Beijing would reclaim its Middle Kingdom status, at least in the Indo-Pacific region, by the mid to late 2030s, as well as his very ambitious project to challenge the US and other Western powers in high-tech areas such as AI, robotics, bioengineering, and so forth. These long-standing plans will be going forward, even though as a result of the partial ban on the export of key components to Chinese high-tech companies, first introduced by former President Trump and followed by Biden, the Chinese faces obstacles. At the 20th Party Congress, which will be close to the public, unfortunately, we will see some heavy debate amongst the top officials, even though, generally speaking, seeing the strength of Xi Jinping, which has been manifested in his recent ability to convince his colleagues in the Politburo to stand foursquare behind Vladimir Putin, and also to stick closely to a very draconian regime for zero tolerance policy against the pandemic. Xi Jinping seems to be in a strong position. But after the one major result of the Party Congress has come out, that means the membership of the 200-odd Central Committee members, the membership of the 25-member Politburo and the 7-member Politburo Standing Committee, we will see that Xi Jinping will be forced to make some compromise. That means he will allow several slots to be given to so-called members of the opposition. In the Politburo Standing Committee, I see that the Xi Jinping faction, which is now the strongest clique within the party, he will be able to get 3 out of the 7 seats, whereas the members representing the other factions might have to be contented with a much smaller share of the top positions. But still, Xi Jinping's power is not without restraints, simply because most of the mid to top echelon cadres grew up and spent the bulk of their career during the 40 years of Deng Xiaoping's reforms. And Xi Jinping's fairly obtrusive and unpopular attempts to stand many of Deng Xiaoping's institutional and economic reforms, including Deng Xiaoping's largely pro-West, market-oriented economic policy, have alienated quite a number of senior cadres. So the short conclusion is that Xi Jinping will be around at least until the early to mid 2030s, but he faces formidable opposition within the party, even though because of his control over the armed forces and the police, it's unlikely that there would be a drastic change in China's policy. And given the rise of nationalism amongst high school and university students and other sectors of the population, it's likely that Xi Jinping, for example, regarding the Ukrainian crisis, has followed the Russian line of putting the blame on the so-called eastward expansion of the U.S., NATO, and the EU. So the conclusion is that because Xi has promised to the party to complete national reunification, that means be absorbing Taiwan within his lifetime, and also successfully challenge U.S. supremacy in the Pacific, the antagonism and contention between China and the U.S. will stay, and it could be exacerbated. Okay, thank you.
That's a lot to unpack. Thank you so much for that that insight. So you're saying that in addition to factional rivalries, Xi also has opponents who are among the other princelings, which is fascinating in and of itself. But your conclusion, he's going to be around for a while, so Washington should not get its hopes up that there will be a drastic change. That brings me to some questions for Joe. Joe, back in 2012, 2013, there was a lot of talk about Xi being an economic reformer. In fact, I don't know if you follow Rhodium's work, but sure. They have done some great benchmarking Chinese economic reforms against the program Xi released in 2013. Any chance of a return to kind of a reform and opening? What do you expect economic policy to look like in Xi's third term? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Yes, I do remember the third plenum back then, which had the statement that said that market forces should be decisive in the economy, and everybody seemed to get their hopes up that China was on a cusp of a new wave of market-oriented reforms. And I think by now we've all been disabused of that optimism. In fact, of course, the economic reforms that we thought were going to be implemented simply were not implemented. If anything, it has gone the other direction, particularly with the unexpected crackdown on Alibaba and other high-tech firms, which seem to be leading the Chinese economy in a more market-oriented direction. And now, especially with China, Made in China 2025 and other things, we see much more of a drive to have it centralized, state-oriented economy. Is this going to change? Well, that begins to lead you to the 20th Party Congress. We don't know, of course, who is going to take the economic portfolios. One of the positions that will be changed is the premiership. Li Keqiang has served 2 terms, and assuming that the party follows at least most of the norms of the past, he will step down. He's one of only 3 people who will step down, Li Jianshu and Han Zheng being the other 2 who by age should step down. So, who's going to take over that premiership? There's a lot of speculation that somebody like Hu Chunhua, who came up through the Communist Youth League, will take that portfolio, in which case one would expect Xi Jinping's economic model to follow pretty much what it has been, which has been to reduce the power of the premiership, centralize economic control in his own hands, in which case one would expect for no major change in economic policy. Another person who's going to step down, though, is Vice Premier Liu He. He's not on the Politburo Standing Committee, but he is on the Politburo. And so presumably Xi will be looking to another vice premier for his chief advice on the economy. It's possible that would be a reform-minded economist, but it's also quite possible that it would be somebody perhaps even more conservative than Liu He. One of the questions that is up there is, where will Wang Yang go? Wang Yang will be 67, and so supposedly will continue in office. He would be an interesting choice as a premier or as a primary economic advisor, maybe an executive vice premier, something of that sort. He seems to be a bit more market-oriented than Xi Jinping. There are a lot of things that are up in the air still that will come out of the 20th Party Congress. China's had a tradition of having very strong premiers. One thinks of Zhu Rongji and obviously Zhou Enlai and so forth. Xi Jinping has not followed that model. There might be some effort to try to increase the prominence of the premier. That would be interesting and might address some of the economic problems. As you know, China's productivity has been falling for years, and this predates Xi Jinping. And so there's going to be a lot of pressure on him to do some economic reform. How this will shake out is hard to say. As we speak, of course, COVID is making quite a comeback in Shanghai and other places, and this will have a significant effect on the economy. And so that's another pressure, along with lower productivity. And if you're thinking a little bit longer term, China faces quite a demographic challenge. China is an aging society. And so, one would expect that to try to counter this, you would get, younger people, more market-oriented, more, even more open. These things all cut against what Xi Jinping has been doing the last 10 years. So he's going to face some very fundamental challenges as he hits the 20th Party Congress. In any case, I don't want to go on too long, but maybe it's worth pointing out that, I agree with Willie completely that Xi is going to be there for at least another 10 years. If you have only 3 people retiring from the Politburo Standing Committee, if you wanted to put in somebody in place to be a successor, a premier and potentially a new general secretary, that would be 2 of those seats. I don't think Xi Jinping is going to give up 2 seats to a successor. So I think we will not see any sign of a successor, which as Willie says, means that she will be there for another 5 years after that. This really does challenge what I think Deng Xiaoping was trying to do. Deng Xiaoping's sort of biggest push for an institutional change was to institute a rule that the General Secretary not appoint his own successor. In other words, that power be decentralized within the party, and that the General Secretary's seat should be passed around to different wings of the party. Xi has completely reversed that, and it seems certain that he will try to appoint his own successor. And that will exacerbate infighting within the party. People will resent being passed over. They will feel that they have no choice if they come up the wrong ladder there. Let's see. Well, you asked about the economy. Maybe I'll let you ask something else. Have more of a conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. Actually, you covered pretty much. You covered the question pretty well. So it's very much up in the air. If I'm understanding what you're saying, it's going to depend in part on who else is in. Who's the premier, who's in charge of the economy, who unofficially perhaps is in charge of the economy, sort of to the extent that some of Xi's key allies were this past term. I wanted to go back to something that you said, actually, and or you mentioned, you didn't expound on, and I was going to speak a little bit about this for our audience. So you mentioned the topic of norms, or sort of the procedures that in the Deng era, and they continued developing in the Jiang era, that were established to sort of govern the transition of power. And there's a lot of talk right now. A lot of people are like, well, they don't even matter anymore. Xi has completely demolished the norms. And I actually, I don't quite see it that way. Now, I'll give people who look at it from that angle, I'll give them this, and that is that there are no real set in stone norms. Nothing is written down that governs, how long party officials can stay in power. There's nothing set in stone that says that the party Congress, after their 68th birthday, they have to leave office, or that the General Secretary can only stay in for 2 5-year terms. Actually, we've only seen one General Secretary stay in for exactly 2 5-year terms. That was Hu Jintao, a very weak General Secretary who lived under his predecessor's shadow the entire time. So, but from, I actually do think that the norms have been respected a lot more than most people give Xi and give the party leadership credit for. These informal customs or norms are actually very important to China's elite. The party elite, they see them as legitimate generally. They see them as desirable and important for China's political stability. And in the Xi era, we've seen pretty much that they've mostly stuck, with the exception of Xi Jinping himself. So we expect them not to apply to him, for him, as you both said, to be in office at least another 10 years. But if we look back at the 19th Party Congress 5 years ago, all throughout the Party Congress, there were still rumors, lots of rumors, that Xi's key ally Wang Qishan was going to stay in the standing committee. And a lot of people were surprised when he retired from his party leadership roles, but he was instead made vice president, and he was allowed to continue attending standing committee meetings, but as a non-voting member. And there's actually that's actually not there's actually precedent for that. It happened extensively in the Deng era, for example. Deng himself and several other figures were attending these meetings, and at least on paper, were not voting. The question then is, why did Wang not remain in the standing committee? Was it because she tried but failed to keep him there? Or was it because she always intended to have him step down from formal party office? So he has been, for those other than himself, he's been a stickler for rules. He's been trying to govern the party with more rules. And I think these norms, they help prevent him, they do help prevent his allies from staying in power indefinitely, but he has many allies that he's placed in high positions. They also prevent his rivals from staying in power long enough to pose a threat. So I do think that the most likely scenario is we are going to see most of these leadership succession norms stay valid, continue to be followed during this party Congress, but will probably, I doubt they'll apply to him. The top dog has always almost always been able to circumvent these norms as they apply to him. But there could be surprises here or there. It's not impossible that we'd see Liu He, for example, stay in office and become premier, although I do think that it's more likely that he will get an unofficial advisory role, or potentially take Wang Qishan's place as vice president, but that he will not have an official party leadership role. So that's, I guess, my take on sort of the question of norms. We did want to get there are several questions from the audience coming in. And let me see. Here's the first one. And if, let's see which of the two of you wants to answer this, but do Putin's failures in Ukraine make a CCP invasion of Taiwan less likely?
I think it possibly makes it more likely. The optimistic scenario is that China will look at the world reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and say, oh boy, we can't go there. I think that the lesson for China, unfortunately, is that if you want to invade Taiwan, do it quickly, do it efficiently, and wrap it up quickly. None of this, extended combat that you have in Ukraine. I've always have thought that China's optimal position was military pressure and economic pressure, a combination of the two. I think that the odds of China simply using military force is fairly small. I think that you can combine, the idea is to keep the U.S. out of any particular conflict. One of the lessons of the Ukrainian conflict is the United States does not want to directly fight another nuclear power. China is a nuclear power. This will increase China's leverage in a Taiwan scenario.
Thank you, Joe. We have another question that's come in from Han Chan at Radio Free Asia. Given China is facing, this is a really important question, given China is facing the largest wave of COVID cases that it's had yet, particularly in Shanghai, how will the outcomes of the zero COVID policy in the coming months affect Xi's prospects for the party Congress? Joe, you answered the last one. Let me see. Would you like to take this one, Willie?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, as I understand, there was a bit of controversy at the very top of the party whether China should still stick to this zero tolerance policy versus the most other countries' approach, which is coexistence with the virus. However, Xi Jinping has said many times, both within the party and publicly, that Beijing's success in containing the virus in the past 2 years shows that the China model is more successful than the Western model and so forth. And as I said, the extent to which Xi Jinping has gone in making sure that Shanghai, where there is a lot of resistance to forced quarantine and other draconian measures, Xi Jinping decided to show that he can tame Shanghai by sending in several thousand soldiers from different military regions to the metropolis. Shows that Xi Jinping is determined to stick to his policy, even at the expense of a possible threat to the attainment of the 5.5% growth rate predicted by Premier Li Keqiang at the National People's Congress. In general, we see that Xi Jinping is a very obstinate person. He's not easily persuaded to take a different route, despite the fact that there are indications that they are developing a new generation of vaccination which uses the Western formula rather than the traditional Chinese formula. And could I add just a little bit to what Bill was saying earlier regarding the economic team? That is strong speculation, and I think pieces of evidence to back this up that Mr. He Lifeng, the head of the NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission, would replace Liu He as the principal economic advisor to Xi Jinping. And Mr. He, unfortunately, even though he worked with Xi Jinping for some 20 years in Fujian province, is considered to be a run-of-the-mill apparatchik. And as for the replacement of Li Keqiang, I think that is pretty much a consensus amongst China watchers in Beijing that it would be Hu Chunhua, who is a current vice premier. And Hu Chunhua spent almost 20 years of his career in Tibet, and he is not known to be as knowledgeable about international finance as either Liu He or Li Keqiang. So I'm afraid that regarding both the pandemic and economic policy, Xi Jinping would stick to the norms which he's convinced are working for China and so forth.
Great, thank you both for your questions. There's one last question, and I'll take this question. We have about a minute and a half left. So the question is, while Xi seems to be on path for a next term, are there any key actors or players we should keep an eye on within CCP domestic politics? So I guess in addition to Xi, and both of you have actually touched on this. And so just, I guess, to summarize that, I'd say, Xi is going to stay in power, almost definitely, but the amount of power and influence he has to pursue his agenda is really going to depend on, does he manage to get a majority of his allies? Are they able to form a majority of Politburo Standing Committee seats, Politburo seats? Is he going to end up with one of his people as premier, which probably, it's not looking good for that. Now, one person I'd look at, though, is Hu Chunhua. Will he have no problems? Will he manage to be taken down for corruption? Will he just be somehow be stonewalled and not able to get in? Does Xi appoint someone else? Or does he manage to get someone else appointed a vice premier before the party congress? Because currently there's only, it has always been the case that the incoming premier has been a serving vice premier. And currently the only one not set to retire is Hu Chunhua. Another person I'd look at is Li Keqiang. Is he going to retire from the standing committee, or is he just going to step down as premier and say lead the NPC or something, the National People's Congress or something like that? Because if he stays in the standing committee, then that's one more seat that cannot be filled with one of Xi's people. So yeah, lots of people to look at. I encourage everyone interested in that also to read the report that we put out that you can find on the Heritage website that goes into more detail about these people besides Xi that we should be paying attention to. We have come to the end of this program. It is, I guess we're 1 minute late. Thank you everyone for participating. It has been, hopefully, I've found it to be a fruitful discussion, and I hope everyone else has gotten a lot out of this as well. Any final remarks by Willie or Joe, the sort of 30-second version?
Well, I would look at the people who are 67 on the Politburo Standing Committee. That's Wang Yang, it's Wang Huning, it's Li Keqiang. 67, you talk about norms. Is it Qishang Basha? 7 up, 8 down, or we have some interesting changes in those people. The 67 group is fascinating to look at.
Thank you. Yes, very important point. Willie.
Well, I will only add that we should pay more attention to the 7th generation officials. That means cadres born in the 1970s, because if Xi Jinping were to stay around for 10 years or more, then the entire 6th generation officials, people born in the 1960s, might be out of contention for top jobs, because anybody who was born in 1964 or earlier would be 68 by the time of the 22nd Party Congress in 2032, and therefore theoretically, according to the convention, ineligible to get into the standing committee. However, while there are already a few dozen 7th generation officials now occupying the position of vice minister or vice governor, vice mayors of major cities and so forth, we don't see anybody who is really outstanding and so forth. So Deng Xiaoping was very right to insist upon a institutional-based succession plan. But Xi Jinping, because of his personal ambition, has now made this a very precarious proposition. And this is a potential point of contention amongst the various factions, which might damage the legitimacy of the party.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you everyone for your participation. We will now close the meeting. Be sure to stay up, look at our website for information on more future events by the Asian Studies Center or by the Heritage Foundation generally. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.